think I need to wear the beret for this one. Shit's about to get a little revolutionary. Or maybe not. So, ubuhle bendoda zinkomo zayo. We'll put the translation in there, which kind of loosely says something like, the prestige of a man is in, literally speaking, his stock. Now that stock that is alluded to in the actual proverb are cows, which, if you know anything about indigenous South African history, were a source of currency, amongst other things. They were basically a way to code wealth. Communities saw and understood the context of their wealth through the amount of cows they had. A cow was a valuable creature. It was a form of food, assistance. It was a ritualistic conduit. It was a medium through which Africans, particularly in Southern Africa, could understand how to pass down family lines, how to preserve the wealth that they had, and most importantly, how to engage with the land that they were navigating around. Come colonialism, it crashes that whole structure and system of African wealth. The system of how African measured wealth. This system that could be akin to something like a barter trade, and an understanding of the fact that if you have something that I don't and I have something that you don't, we meet in these neutral lines where we can understand elements of value. Now, many might say this comes close to what capitalism is, but arguably capitalism does something a little bit more than the trading of resources according to value. Capitalism shifts the dynamic of an economy from something which can be said to be horizontal, where we are understanding how we can coexist, to something that is vertical, to a literal rat race of trying to be the richest, trying to be at the top, and preserving whatever kept you there. Therefore, it's a system that promotes growth at the expense of ecology, whereas the system that Africans used promoted growth in the context of ecology. And this has a lot to do with masculinity, because say what you will, what being a man is about in every corner of the earth, if we are to regard the classical archetype of what a man is it is what you have. Males are culturally bred to identify themselves with the ability to provide. You know, this archaic image of the chest-beating hunter-gatherer who is the source of strength, virility and vitality, and who is symbolized as this kind of gestural, imposing figure that gives power to the community. Which community? Particularly the community of the family. He gives to the community as the main figure. And as a result, men subconsciously see themselves as beings who are raised to become givers, resourceful givers, givers of actual material wealth. And therefore, if you as a man cannot give material wealth, cannot give any kind of real value, you start to feel as if your masculinity is at stake. That in fact, you might not be a man at all. So as a result, this idea of masculinity holds within it a incessant need for the man to identify himself according to what he has, or the capacity to get something. The capacity to acquire resources. These resources could be actual mineral resources. These resources could be any objective. These resources could be people. In fact, indeed, the highest resource in the hierarchy of masculinity can be said to be the woman itself, because in a way that is hidden and implicit, men get all these other resources in order to attract the respect and of course the daring admiration of women. And they therefore become top of the food chain. When you have a lot to give, you're able to be seen as a prospective husband, provider, lover, whatever you want to be, in the eyes of those who you see as a resource. I want to take the politics of masculinity in all of its guises and bring it into the context of being South African. I can't speak too much for any other part of the world. So what I'm going to try to do during this session is to take everybody through a journey of the evolution, or maybe the history, because there's not much evolution that has happened of South African black masculinity. Why black? Because again, we start in a historical place where Africa, in the indigenous context, is inhabited by people who came to this land through migrations of sustenance. We find all these different ethnicities, and before you scream out Xhosa, Zulu, Pedi, Tswana, there's a whole episode that needs to be done about how the category of 11 official languages, which all have their own unique tribal roots, is also an apartheid construct. Right now, for the sake of this episode, I'm not going to be referring to a lot of tribal lines, because those are also conspiracy and basically an illusion. I'm going to try to stick to something a little bit more socio-economic. And by doing that, I am forced to relegate myself to referring to certain ethnic contexts. But mind you, these ethnicities I don't see as inherent core groups that people necessarily belong to. They're simply migratory patterns of different identities people assume because of the conspiracies that they go through. What conspiracies? Famine, war, intermingling, engagement, interaction, people moving amongst each other, learning from each other, learning to get away from each other, learning to perhaps coexist with each other, is the reason why we cannot have a romantic fantasy where you feel you are exclusively Zulu, another feel like they're exclusively Xhosa, another feels that they're exclusively Tswana or Pedi, because the moment you think that these are boxes, you forget that they're born through countless hybrid connections, through different kinds of people with different stories, different energies, and different mythologies coming together for certain particular reasons. And like I said, that's a whole other episode. So let's go into the history of South African black masculinity. Where do we begin the story? I think the natural part that we would have to display and start this story would be with the advent of modernization. So I'm going to start the story with modernization, because we can't speak for the kind of pre-modernization period, because what it is that it can't be accounted to in a sense that is historical enough for it to trickle into the influence of the modern times. Of course, every South African ethnic line have those kings and queens and figures, whether you're talking about Utingiswayo or you're talking about King Insa. There are figures that are extolled as tribal archetypes, icons, but those figures don't really hold much practical influence. None of my motherfuckers are waking up and go, what would Dingiswayo do? They're not figures who are presently active in the immediate moment of how black South African men see themselves. So as a result, they are basically mythological furniture to fatten the argument that what masculinity is about is a conquest of power. Because all we hear about these kings is their victories and their losses. We don't learn about their vulnerabilities. We do not learn about who they were integrally as people, their weaknesses. All we know is what they did, and most often what they did is start a war or try to prevent one. What they did is start a conflict or try to prevent one. These are figures who are caught up in the history of how nations define themselves. So as a result, they cannot be considered pop, because what popular culture does is that it elevates people to a level of the role model. The role model is the figure that represents the ideals that people want to attain, because they're relative to the system that tells them those qualities will be rewarded in this context. So we have to start with the advent of mass media, television. And we're talking about, in South Africa to be specific, the 50s to the late 60s. So now, the South African Broadcasting Corporation, Mnet, MultiChoice, those all deserve episodes of their own. But I'm going to sum it up by saying, white South African colonizers, through the development of industrial culture and the fast-paced media sprawling of a direction that makes it crucial for communications to be an integral part of every Western country. They start to implement radio and television in the country, but still under the auspices of a colonial banner. See, what you need to understand is, as you watch MultiChoice in its guise today, the roots of what it began as Mnet, the people who are in charge of that conglomerate are the Afrikaner elite. The SABC is started by the white elite. South African media, as we know it, has been founded, established, built on the principles, extended until this very day serves the interests of the white elite, or whiteness in general. As black as MultiChoice has become through the conglomerate of Mzansi channels and the way that it takes South African culture and tries to kind of leak it out as this generic story of crime and passion, the way that SAPC has just become a parrot for whatever social media is doing, this is all due to the fact that the politics of how mass media has been run in South Africa has been extremely political. Because even when the baton of power, so to speak, was handed down to black faces, while still remaining structurally white, what those black faces did with the SABC and every other mass media outlet is that they turned into a wing for political propaganda. A way to tell the stories of the leaders that they want to thrive in the image of the people. So this is what brings me to this story, because if we are to look at the way that mass media has impacted South Africans, we have to look at how colonialism takes people from their vast tribal context, it removes them and places them in this industrial capital center of the city, where many Africans are forced to move from their places of indigenous birth to these new created designs which are there to totally transform them from people to subjects. And once they become subjects, they become slaves whose main motive is now to serve the priority of money, so that they are able to sustain their families in this now forced economy that they are imprisoned to participate in. This capitalistic structure, which starts by taking from them through the mines, and you have black men moving in droves to different parts of South Africa, simply looking for a way to survive now that the ominous spirit of the white man is upon them. And the media that they were given, the radio that they were given to listen to, when white people decided to give the Bantu their own entertainment, was simply a direct byproduct of what they wanted the black man to be, the project of apartheid. The project of colonialism, the project of imperialism, is to limit the capacity of the black imagination, or the African imagination, into blackness. Blackness being this open vortex and wormhole, of absolute darkness, depth, and non-existence, where you find yourself in this timeless limbo subjected to the agency of white power. And this is what happened, because in the advent of South African mass media, we have the rise of a binary that I term as the charmer gangster.
I'm just in the business of making a better life for all.
The inhabitants of Hillbrow call you the African Robin Hood. They say you're a champion of the poor, that you take back land stolen from them by the whites.
I've done nothing illegal.
Then how did you acquire your alias, the Hoodlum of Hillbrow?
I don't know what you mean.
Versus the Township Bomb.
There we go, son. Hey, how much you got? Listen, sir. Meet Binagazi. And meet Styles there. He thinks it's Sammy Davis Jr.
Now, the Chama Gangster is the image that whiteness foists on black men as animals, as aggressors, as homoeroticized, sexualized beings who possess this one urge, this bloodlust for power. Really, it's an attempt to villainize the image of the black man as something not to be trusted and something to be feared. Now, if we look at the first real archetypes of South African media in the way that they depicted, especially in early television, we had people like Ken Kampu, who depicted this kind of stoic, hard figure of ruthless aggression, displaying very little sensitivity and absolutely no range and vulnerability whatsoever. That image is the very same image which today has been expressed through the characters that were mainly played by Menzingubani, whether you called him Ngamla or you called him by another name. Rapulana Sipem, through his Tao Mukhale character, is also depicted as somebody who displays a level of charm but is always in the context of aggression.
Once, twice,
3 times, damn it, Dauda!
He's a man of power. He's a man whose prestige is held in the stead of his aggression. And that is why for every Tao Mukhale, there's a Karaba Muroka. This idea of this ruthless gangster charmer image being compatible with the aspirational black woman who seeks the glamour and the glitz make a composite pair. Because this is what capitalism wants. It wants black women to pursue this ideal of hyper-branded feminization that tells them that they could be the boss girl image and find a man who complements their success through his sheer power and his own level of financial influence. So you find this image of the street gangster who amasses enough power to either enter into the boardroom or become a kingpin-like figure in the streets. You name them, in every variety, whether it's Kabashe, just roll a million clips of every South African actor that's male and black, and they've probably become successful through roles like this. But a peculiar role which seemed to kind of use another strategy was in the coming of this kind of idealistic age of the 90s, where the apartheid regime was beginning to realize that it needed to privatize itself and present a black image in order to gain the acceptance of the world, opened up to this mimicry of American archetypes. All of a sudden, we have South African media trying to find aspects of masculinity which didn't really exist in the world of black South African masculinity, but could be transplanted as a mode to aspire to. So for what Ken Kampu represented, for what Henry Cele represents as the stoic figure of Shaka Zulu, who only talks in simple, pithy wisdoms which don't give anything off other than protect the tribe, protect the nation.
You have a spirit of a Zulu.
What kind of a spirit is that? What valor is needed to slaughter innocent children?
You speak to me of an innocent? Those ships of yours, where do they take the children of Africa? Is there a monster in your world who feeds on our flesh? Huh?
For all of the imagery that has been displayed by some of the most influential black men, there has always been a certain level of guardedness. And this was a guardedness which could scare a new generation which needed hope, which needed to see a black man who felt a bit optimistic. A new generation. Hence, Mfundi Vunda, coming from an experience as a writer in America, virtually steals the whole idea of the American soapy trope, whether it's The Days of Our Lives or The Bold and the Beautiful Idea, this story of powerful families with corporate dynasties, and he transplants it into the South African socio-economic context in a time where, to be honest with you, it really didn't exist in this way. But he depicts generations as a kind of aspirational world where black people inhabit the spaces that they wish to be in. Enter Achimoroka, a figure whose handsomeness was both delicate but still rugged, whose dreadlocks were a tad bit experimental but still stuck to a kind of indigenous bearing to them. And of course, this warm, husky, deep voice. He became the consummate image of what South African men wanted to be. He felt confident in himself. He understood who he was. He wasn't afraid to admit his faults. But through it all, he remains nothing but a 90s extension of the charmer gangster.
Miss Nokela, let me let you in on a secret. I've been toying around with the idea of letting you go. Keep behaving like this towards me. I won't have to search too hard for a reason. There are dozens of young advertising executives out there dying to join this agency.
What Archie is the sophistication of the charmer gangster as a corporate man. He's the South African tycoon. He's Richard Maponya. He's Patrice Motsepe. He's all these figures in the embodiment of a pop culture figure. And this was the moment where South African black masculinity immediately and deliberately sell this idea that the new South African black man must have a door in this white world, which was hitherto not something we could access, but now we could. The most successful South African black man were those who roamed amongst white folks, spoke to them as colleagues, and could amass the same capitalist power that they did. And that's why till this very day, the figures that I mentioned, the Motsepes, the Maponyas, the Ramaphosas, are revered by South African men, not by their ethical compass, but by their sheer capitalist power. The fact that Cyril Ramaphosa had a herd of wildebeest just roaming around, and mansions and land, that is a testament to how far he is from the everyday black South African experience. The fact that Patrice Motsepe, with all of his supposed distinguished gentlemanly features, Richard Maponya, listen even to the way that these men speak. If you listen to how Patrice speaks, how Maponya spoke, how Ramaphosa speaks, there's an aspiration to be white, to sound white, to soften up all of their African ruggedness into a palette which is acceptable not only for the white gaze, but for the white ear and the totality of white existence.
People, to know that you are our future. You are the future of this country. What I would like to see you do, I want you to go to school and get educated, and when you've got the education, you must come back and stop having the idea of entitlement. There is nothing like entitlement. Please have discipline of starting things yourselves.
It's a matter that, and various others that people talk about. But you must also take account that there's been many things over the last 20, 25 years which relates to our businesses where people for various reasons either competition, raise issues, and we respect that. We have to be transparent. We've got to be accountable. We've got to be.
These are black men who understand survival as being the whitest version of yourself you can be, no matter what the compromise. Hence, the figure of Archie Moroka is that. It's the black man willing to compromise himself, his own people, for capitalist success. Follow the storylines in the early generations and this is what you'll see. But it's wrapped in this romantic idea of love interests and sagas of murder and espionage, when really what Archie is just a way for a singular goal of individual freedom to survive. The Morokas represent the family that every black man belongs to. And as a result, Archie becomes the heir to what capitalism can do for you as a black man. Right in the heels of that, South Africa opens itself up to this dynamic, multi-genre approach of how to depict black men. And in the midst of all of the aggression, we have a particular figure who opens us up to a different kind of imagination. The imagination that I called the township bub. Joe Mafela is a thespian who saw South Africa through the lens of laughing at itself.
Yabona ayisangicaceli mina lento ukuthi sokumele ukuthi ngenzeni manje.
Akufanele ukucacele ngoba umdlalo lo. Bakithi, akungcono ngingafa kunoma ngithande omunye.
So fast lahlaneke gogo.
Shayisa ngathi uyangiyeka. Ungabe ubiza ngogogo wena.
Yabona
ngumululela.
He understood the intricacies of how painful the embodiment of black existence was, and how to be black is essentially to be relegated as a zombie, to not live. And so him and people like him, people like Ndaba Mhlongo, aka Umshefane,
Sivalena amehlo. Hayi. Valana amehlo. Baba. Vala amehlo. Baba wethu osehezulwini. Mali hloniswe igama lakho. Umbuso wakho manje. Umbuso wakho manje. Emhlabeni wethu.
People like Rain Tlokwana and many other thespians used humor as a medium to show blackness in a way which made people loosen themselves up, calm down, in a way which wasn't intimidating. If Archie Moroka's goal was a kick in the door, Stumo, Velapi, and Mshefane were going to silently whisper at the door and ask if they could come in. They sought the permission of whiteness, but they did it in a way where they were so jovial and buoyant and lovable that white people could see them as nothing but passive, pet-like images that could easily be submissive. So through the image of School is Nice, which by the way as a show broke ratings and became South Africa's largest sitcom, rightfully so, with the genius writing of Joe Mafela, who was able to take the anecdotal humor and conversations of the everyday township experience and distill them into this family-friendly experience of a man living in a flat or living right in the house and renting and having to interact with characters who people in the township could relate with. The black woman who had to sustain a household without a husband. The roving preacher who sought to exploit different people in the community by just his prestige as a preacher.
Ngoba uSidumo usitshelile ukuthi uyeza sesikulungisela iDNA cake emfundisi nawo.
Ngikhuluma ngamakheke nentiye ngapha usathano haqe ubunina nemphefumulo yenu.
You know, the young black girl who saw a promise of a new South Africa and was trying to navigate who she could be. Joe Mafela understood the kind of caricatures which could really express the kind of ideas and personalities that South Africans were used to and were common amongst us. But he also had to play within this very, very narrow tunnel of black expression, which didn't allow for one thing. Because whether it is the aggression displayed by the thug, charmer, gangster from the 80s to today, whether it is the humorous idea of what this bomb in the township is supposed to be, there's a middle ground there that is never explored for a reason. And that is depicting black men in the township as sources of profound reflection and intelligence. We hardly find figures whose charisma resides in their intellect. I mean, even in the political sphere, figures like Mandela were watered down to messianic models of saving people. He himself, in fact, as he was morphing through his political ideology and understanding the importance of self-determination and the incorporation of actual militancy, still maintained a certain level of calmness that was very careful not to alarm the white domination. Mandela, even in his most radical form, was playing it safe. And as a result, when he was depicted as this Jesus-esque figure, he allowed this image to become the dominating force that would in fact be very crucial to how the ruling party would win the election. It would win it under the banner of believing in a man who was not really a man, but something special. And by elevating black intellect as something transcendent, you can't have any Mandelas in the streets because literally, there is no one like him. This is a once-in-a-lifetime singularity. And this is what has happened. South African media either pushes away and casts a shadow over real brilliance of black critical intellect, the Sobukwes, the Chris Hanis, and relegates them as background figures, or it elevates them so high that the average black man feels that they could not attain that level of intelligence. Unless, of course, you're somewhere in the academy trying to become some version of a modern-day African intellectual. But even then, whatever intellectual capacity and prowess for ideological analytics and an understanding of the world you have is used by the universities as a way to proliferate the same colonial program. Of course, nowadays, masquerading itself as a decolonialization, when the same elitism, the same exclusionary tactics, the same recipes that mean that every dissertation, paper, book, ideology that South African intellectuals have thought of and created never reaches the grassroots of the people that it attempts to speak for. And the media assists in that. It assists in pushing back the Tsietsi Mashininis and giving us the image of a Hector Peterson who was dying. When the youth masterminding the marches were young black intellectuals who understood Pan-Africanism, who understood Afrocentricity, who understood the connection between the continent and the diaspora, who had a deep ingrained teaching of political theory and practice. That's never what they tell you every time they celebrate our political history. You're given this romantic image of transcendent men who are not meant to be emulated, but simply revered. And the media helps, even in sports. If our soccer stars are not depicted as fast-talking, Pansula-type figures, whose prowess with the ball can be likened unto the dance of South African clubs or shebeens, where the Pansula with Ipanama yake and his all-star is able to move his body in a way where the physical contortion again subjects itself to this jester image. I mean, think about it. Don't Trompies kind of look like a troupe of circus clowns?
That's not funny.
That's not...
If you look at the color coding, if you look at the subliminal messages of how South African dance is portrayed, it's always humorous or aggressive and erotic. Again, it's the same thing. If you're not trying to be sexy, or trying to be angry, or trying to be funny, you're not trying to be anything. Nobody is thinking, or nobody is promoted to think. Black men are simply told that this is the situation that they have, they need to deal with it, and there's only two ways out. You laugh through it, or you try to use your aggression to blast and use your own masculine force to elevate up the capitalist rungs. So that's why today, predominantly, the celebrated South African black man is the black man who's either aiming for material wealth, driving his polo, amassing his own confidence by the amount of women he has, or the man who's able to crack a joke and make women laugh all the way to his bedroom. There is this contorted image of blackness either as calming us into this place where we forget about the situation temporarily, or aggressing us into this place where we force ourselves to become a part of it. But never do we popularize figures who tell us, can we at least be aware of what's happening? Can we be aware of the ideology working us as it works us? I mean, even the most so-called intellectual figures, if we enter into the Kwaito era as South African commercial mass media is growing, and the young black youth take international house music, slow it down, they add their own vocals and a township flair, Kwaito is born. And even there, accompanied by the dances, you have a very jovial spirit. It's happy-go-lucky. It's about forgetting everything. It isn't really about centering us in the reality. Sure, there was political commentary, but it was just so slightly squeezed in to the context of a kind of happy escape that it couldn't land perpetually in the minds of the people. So even as Alaska would talk about, I choose number one, you didn't really reflect on the fact that what this was an indictment on black men being in prison. All you saw was an opportunity to catch on trend. Kancane, olera. Colonialism era is destroying your mind there. And that's all I gotta say here. So this process continues through mass media traditionally. This is why even in soccer, you would celebrate a Dr. Khumalo figure whose quick moves and lack of actual commentary on the South African existence is perfect. Rather than Eshuz Musheu, whose life isn't really glittered by anything glamorous. It's a simple man who finds discipline in consistency and being a little bit more conservative. So even then, the idea of the black South African man must be exciting. It must be exciting in a way that feels edgy. So it doesn't lend itself to this conservative figure unless it's met with these traditional figures of elderhood. So you have the grown South African man, Itai Maubaba, like Javas's father in Izo Izo. You have this stoic, strong figure who will beat you if you do anything vaguely outside of his law.
Baba ngeke ngiye emaplazini.
Oh, ngiyakubona ukuthi ngigcelela wena. Uyaphendula futhi. Ngikhathele nguwe. Esikoleni bakhala ngawo ubona umkhulu wezinto lapha.
This is the way conservatism is displayed, not as a kind of quiet obedience to culture and as a kind of ethical path into a disciplined way. Chuz Musheu was more like a samurai, where Doctor was more like a military war hero. One fights through moving in the silence and swinging his blade with precision. One is loud about his entrance. And South Africans like this boisterous flamboyance. We celebrate soccer players, actors, musicians who are eccentric about the way that they are. And we scorn on those who choose to be a little bit more reserved. Why do we do this? It's conditioned. It's part of the way South African black masculinity has been depicted. And as a result, as we go into this postmodern age with the South African black manhood tradition being transferred into the modern day manosphere, what South African black manosphere has become is the image of pursuing capitalism either through making a fool of yourself or turning yourself into an aggressor. And this is why the GBV. Because if you're not trying to beat the system physically and anything that stands in your way, what you're trying to do is dance to its tune. And this is why the middle ground can never be reached. And this is why even in movements which potentially revolutionize the way youth see themselves, YFM comes as a radio station which doesn't come from the traditional platform, but still speaks to the youth in a way that presents the current modern aesthetics. The Rude Boy Pauls, the DJ Kabzelas, the figures like DJ Smooth, who went on to become South Africa's premier entertainment black capitalist. Whereas figures like Rude Boy, who was about Pan-Africanism, Afrocentricity, a dreadlocked young black man hosting Jam Alley.
Come on, he's whack, man. He's whack. He's whack. Whack MC. 5. Okay, double for $500 for you, my man.
With dancehall references and all kinds of black nationalist references, is relegated to the side, and who becomes the famous one? DJ Smooth. There's a reason for that. There's a reason why DJ Smooth is part of the lineage that opens up the way for men like Penuel. There's a reason why South African masculinity, from the days of TV1, TV2, CCTV, to the day CCV rather, to the days of Bob, to the advent of Radio Metro in all of its DJs, and we enter into the figure of Bob Mabena, who did something very peculiar of becoming South African township culture's mid-transition into global pop culture. Bob Mabena was savvy of the world as it was becoming, but he was also savvy of the streets. And as a result, he becomes the new figure of cool. But if you follow Bob Mabena's life, both in and outside of the studio, it's still pretty much an extension of this very same township charmer figure, with the aggression played down a bit. So if you don't buy my argument by now, you'll have to engage with me robustly in the comment section, because if it is not clear that what South Africa has tried to do is tell black men that they can either be clowns or they can either be aggressors. But if they try to actually use their minds and connect with their souls to understand the underpinnings of what's going around, they're relegated to nothing but a life of non-existence and insanity. So here we are, in the era where we've had the pro kids, who again follows into the cliche of the aggressor. As articulate as he was, his poeticism still fell under this context of chest up high, talk as if you need to beat somebody up. And I mean, I understand the reality of this. The townships are a precarious place. They are a death world in which navigating your life as a black man is a matter of life and death. But does this mean that we are devoid of vulnerability, of sensitivity? Look at our biggest movies. Tsotsi, hijack stories. These are all movies of black aggressive men. Even in the days of Netflix, even in the days of streaming, South Africa still uses a black man with a gun to be the thing that it tries to extol as a symbol of progress. A black man who wants to get the money by any means necessary. And if he's not trying to do that, then he's just trying to make a complete fool out of himself and get money out of it. Hence we have figures like Ifani, whose gimmickry follows into that tradition. Even as groundbreaking as the music was, Pitch Black Afro falls under this image. Where is the black South African intellect in the context of pop culture? He is not allowed. Because if a black man thinks too deeply in South Africa about the way the system is structured, he might realize Vusi Thembekwayo comes through as simply a polished version of Archie Moroka. He's like a real life Archie Moroka who walks and talks the model capitalist plan by telling people that they can be venture capitalists and they can also own business.
And startups are amongst the most effective ways to create solutions and scale them really quickly and impact as many lives as possible. In addition to this, they add new energy into the economy, right? This is the thing about startups. More competition, more fervor, generally younger people, which is an important demography to include in any economy. Look, if you're struggling to get funding, it's not uncommon. I think the first thing to say to every startup founder that's struggling with funding is everybody struggles with funding.
He is an extension of the era where young black South African boys were told that they could make it out the hood by being entrepreneurs, and everybody had to figure out what kind of business they had to start. Until they realized that statistically and practically speaking, very few of us could even make it to becoming business owners, let alone becoming multi-millionaire tycoons. So again, Thembekwayo is an updated version of Maponya, of Mutsepe, of Ramaphosa. He's the televised Tony Robbins-like motivational speaker version of all of those men. And Penuel is simply an extension of that as well, who spices and tries to present himself in a way that's pro-black and militant, when really what he is a caveman with a twang. And this, I say with the utmost modesty, these primal ideas of masculinity as power and femininity as weakness, of masculinity as grip and force and determination and strength and virility, and femininity as silence and weakness, are the very same reasons why South Africa is the way that it is, with our increasing rates of violence that is gender-based. When black women, as much as they love us, fear us in the same breath. Because if they don't fear us, then we become completely useless. We become a stool, living in the back room, unable to truly make our potential and our aspirations work. We are relegated to the townships. We become a clown, we become Velapi, where we are literally messengers of a capitalist idea, driving our little motorbikes. And this is the image. Can we be something in between? We know we can. But TV will never tell you that. Social media will never tell you that. For every progressive thing that social media has done, it still remains in the same context that whiteness serves. Why? Because it still teaches you as a black South African man that if you ain't making that money and are about that power, then what you need to do is try to find a way to laugh through it all and try to navigate through it all. There is no popular figure encouraging critical discourse. Even outspoken figures like Robert Marawa or a Fat Joe or a Pat Komafani, who are known more for their speaking than anything else, are reduced to controversy. Opinionated minds whose ideas are used simply to anger people for the sake of breaking boundaries. And their commentary is selectively chosen to be that which offends rather than really transcends. Maybe that's another conversation, an episode in its own, but I think I've successfully laid out what I believe is the history and the subsequent present of the black South African manosphere. So here we are, in an era where McG inherits this idea. In an era where I saw Bafana Bafana lose the AFCON Cup and the tears of black men were drenching down Shibin floors. Because what Bafana Bafana held was the hope that the Springboks lifted up. The idea that perhaps black men could win in some way. See, this is why Siya Kolisi was so important. As an image, he represents a semblance of global victory for South African black men. Plucked from obscurity, made right by whiteness, cleaned up and turned into a moral figure. Kolisi arrives to us pretty much in the same vein as Mandela, as a superhero. And as much as he has a more grounded influence where kids actually think they could be like him, being like him means finding white people to save you. Being like him is being like Makayandini. Is being like every other talented black boy whose history and talent is reduced to the hand of a white person seeing the talent in them. That's what happens. And that's our story, then till now, as black men. So with that, how can we not still beat the shit out of women and kill them? How can we not still be making fools of ourselves on TikToks, crying about women cheating, and all these kind of viral escapades? Everything, shebe shit, skomota, every aspect of black masculinity in South Africa you can imagine, doesn't it either fit into black aggression or this black comical behavior? Where's the thinking? You never get a sense of what these people are really going through. You either laugh at them or you're intimidated or inspired by them. Either way, this is what every South African black man has attempted and strived to be, because this is what they're convinced they can only be. Even the most creative of the black men in the media, Ricky Rick, as much as he was trying to push the boundaries of fashion, he still plays into this idea that if you can't find your identity in the context of aggression or humor, you have no life to live. AKA, who we know as the aggressor, even on social media, unashamed, unapologetic. He dies in a way that was equally, if not more, aggressive than the life that he lived. So for figures who have tried to show this nuance, there's difficulty in penetrating. Even Double HP, he had to become the chubby dancing rapper. There was an element of humor there. You see? So before I exhaust this argument, this was my presentation of where I feel South Africa has built, constructed, and kept the spirit of the black man. Talk to me, particularly black South African men. If you feel I'm talking shit, if you feel there's some facts to it, engage with us. All I'm saying is, it's time to talk about it. And it's time to find ways to possibly come out of this relegation of either being aggressors or clowns. And as much as I love the young youth today, we've done episodes on different aspects of the political ideology that pushes young black South African talent. Even Maklera. Maklera's whole narrative is founded on the idea of his aggressive past. He wears it as a badge because his rap skill alone would not do that. His affiliation to the streets buys him the cultural clout to be recognized as a man. What do you do with it? My name is Vijay, for the brother from the ancient mother, and I don't know if it was ever safe to be a man, but I live in times where I know that embodying black masculinity is something I increasingly find no value in. Peace.